In this movie, we introduce the concept of floats. Now, in order to understand floats, we really need to understand the nature of natural document flow. Now, essentially, this has to do with how our browser is going to be reading our HTML. When we write our HTML, we write it from top to bottom, and that order is going to be read by the browser, and it's going to dictate what order our elements will be presented in. In our natural document flow, all things will follow one after another in sequence from the top of the document to the bottom. What floats will allow us to do is kind of sidestep that, because it will allow us to take a box and change its position in the flow of our documents in orientation to its parent element. So with floats, we can take an element, either an inline element or a block level element or any other type of element that we know about, and we can float it to the side of its containing element. So if we ended up having an image or a pull quote that we had set up inside of a paragraph, we could take that image or whatever it is that we have, and we can float it out to the side of our paragraph. Now the text that's in that paragraph can wrap around our floated element as it needs to. Now where the float will show up in our flow will be relative to where it was in its original position in the HTML document. So the position of our element in the HTML document will indeed be very, very important. Now, after we've gone in and played around with our different sandbox demonstrations, I do recommend that you review this material. Now, after we've gone into our sandbox and played around a little bit with our float basics, I do recommend that you take the time to experiment with floats yourself to understand exactly what I'm talking about here. In order to float an object, we will have to use our float property. So here we have an example of that being placed on an image, and we use the float property with one of three different options. We have the float right, float left, or float none. First of all, the float none will remove any float that this item might have inherited. Then our right and left options will make it so that our object will float either to the right or to the left of its original position in its containing element. Now when we use our floats, another thing that's going to be important for us to know about is that our floats can be stacked. So if we end up having multiple items that we are floating, and those items appear one right after another in our standard HTML flow, we can stack those items one after another so that we end up having essentially columns. So if we have our first item and we float it to the left, and then we have our second item and float it to the left as well, these items are going to form a stack and they're going to be right next to each other. Now we're going to see this in our sandbox in our upcoming movie. But it is very important to know about our stacking because that's the essence of setting up columns. Now we also have another property that's going to allow us to control how those floats will stack and if they will stack, and that's our clear property. So the clear property has three different options here. We have left, right, and both. And what the clear property will do is it will examine the surrounding floating elements. And if it detects that there is another floating element in either the left, the right, or both directions, it will not stack. It will move down below where that float is and then possibly form its own stack as long as the clear property is not set to both. So for example, if we have an element floating out to the left, and then we have a second element, and we want to float it to the left as well, but we don't want it to stack, we want it to actually appear below that first floated item, we can set our clear property to left, and so it will look to the left, see that there is an object there, and then move it down below that object in our float. The right property value will essentially do the same thing, except it will examine to the right. So if we have a first element and we floated it to the right, and then we have a second element and we want to float it to the right too, but we don't want it to stack on top of the first element, we set the clear property to right, so it will still float to the right, however, it will be placed underneath our first element, but still float out to the right. Now all of this is going to make much more sense when you see it in practice. However, this concludes this movie on our float basics.